The 1990s promised the big comeback of American muscle, bold styling, retro badges, and the hope of raw power returning to the streets. But for every success, there were plenty of failures. Many of these so-called muscle cars were underpowered, cheaply built, or plagued with problems that killed their reputation fast. And now, in 2025, some are being sold as collectibles, when in reality, they're just worthless disappointments. Get ready for the top 12 worthless 90s muscle cars now in 2025. Don't buy them. Stick around till the end, and don't forget to subscribe.
The 1995 Ford Mustang GTS with a 3.8-liter V6 is one of those cars that proves the Mustang nameplate alone was never enough to guarantee performance. By the mid-1990s, Ford had successfully transitioned into the SN95 generation, which looked modern compared to the boxy Fox body cars of the 1980s. The Mustang Cobra and the GT of this era carried the torch well enough, with V8 grunt, aggressive styling, and marketing hype that kept the legend alive. But not every Mustang rolling off the lot was a hero car. The stripped-down GTS with the base V6 was the kind of wannabe muscle car that fooled some buyers back then. And today, in 2025, it's the subject of a strange but misguided wave of nostalgia-driven price hikes. At the heart of the problem was the 3.8-liter Essex V6. On paper, it made around 145 horsepower and 215 pound-feet of torque. That might have sounded like decent numbers in an era when V8s were still reeling from emissions strangulation, but the reality was grim. The GTS weighed nearly 3,300 pounds, which meant that the V6 had to work overtime just to move it with any authority. 0 to 60 times were an unremarkable 9 to 10 seconds, slower than many family sedans of the era. Even worse, the power delivery was rough, with the Essex V6 developing a reputation for its unrefined nature and lack of excitement. Owners frequently described the car as sounding like a cheap rental, with the kind of mechanical growl that never translated into speed. The performance issues were compounded by the GTS's stripped-down approach. The GTS package was essentially Ford's way of offering a lightweight, budget-oriented Mustang for buyers who wanted the Mustang name without the Mustang price. In theory, the GTS was supposed to appeal to drag racers who would buy the cheap shell and swap in their own engines. In practice, many came with the V6 and none of the charisma. Without the GT's throaty exhaust note or the Cobra's aggressive styling cues, the GTS looked more like an economy coupe wearing a famous badge than a true pony car. From the outside, there was almost nothing to distinguish a GTS from the cheapest rental fleet Mustangs that college kids and tourists were abusing all across America. Durability wasn't much better. The Essex V6 was notorious for head gasket failures, a problem so widespread that Ford faced lawsuits and issued extended warranties to cover repairs. Transmission issues weren't uncommon either, especially with the 4-speed automatic that many V6 Mustangs were saddled with. Owners who bought into the affordable Mustang dream quickly realized that their cars were neither fast nor especially reliable. One former owner bitterly recalled, "It looked like a Mustang, but drove like a Taurus with a bad attitude. When the head gaskets blew at 70,000 miles, I knew I should have just bought the GT." Today, in 2025, the SN95 generation is starting to see some collector attention, especially among enthusiasts who grew up in the 1990s. The Cobra models and even the 5.0 GTs are fetching respectable money as nostalgia sets in. Unfortunately, this wave of retro enthusiasm has spilled over into the V6 GTS cars, and sellers are now trying to pitch them as rare collectibles. Listings on auction sites are full of buzzwords like survivor, original, and entry-level Mustang investment, often attached to tired cars with faded paint, cracked interiors, and engines that never excited anyone. The irony is that there's nothing rare or special about these GTS models. They were built in huge numbers and sold to people who just wanted the Mustang look without paying for the V6. What you get in 2025 if you buy one of these collectible GTS V6s is essentially a slow, failure-prone mid-90s Ford with no real performance credentials. They may carry some nostalgic appeal for people who had them as their first car, but that's about it. Compared to the GT and Cobra, they're embarrassing to drive, underwhelming to maintain, and overvalued by sellers who are hoping the Mustang name alone will trick buyers into overpaying. The 1995 Mustang GTS V6 is best remembered as a cautionary tale, a muscle car body saddled with an economy car heart. It looked the part, and it certainly carried the right badge, but behind the wheel, it was just another example of Detroit's willingness to cash in on style while leaving substance behind. In the classic car world of 2025, it belongs in the cheap nostalgia category, not the collectible Mustang conversation. Do you want me to keep this rolling with another fake muscle car from the mid-90s? Maybe something like the 1994 Pontiac Firebird V6 that suffered the same fate as the Mustang?
The 1991 Chevrolet Camaro RS 3.1 V6 sits today as one of those strange contradictions in American car history. A vehicle that visually promised power, speed, and excitement, yet in reality delivered the kind of lethargic performance more suited to an economy sedan than a muscle car. At a glance, the car had everything working in its favor. The sleek, wedge-shaped body of the third-generation Camaro was still one of the most striking designs on the road. Its wide stance and sharp angles suggested a car that could devour pavement with ease. Pop-up headlights gave it that futuristic flair, the RS decals shouted "sporty," and the exhaust note, at least when you first started it up, pretended to be something more sinister than what it really was. Buyers walking into dealerships were told they were getting a piece of the Camaro legend at a lower price point, an entry ticket into the brotherhood of American muscle. But once you slid behind the wheel and planted your right foot, the illusion dissolved almost instantly. Underneath all that fiberglass and flash sat the uninspired 3.1-liter 60-degree V6 engine, a unit that made just 140 horsepower and 185 pound-feet of torque. On paper, that already sounded underwhelming. In practice, it was downright embarrassing. A Camaro, an icon built on the idea of eating Mustangs alive at drag strips, was suddenly struggling to keep pace with family sedans. Contemporary tests showed 0 to 60 times creeping toward 10 seconds, and in the early 1990s, that wasn't just slow, it was humiliating for a car wearing the Camaro name. Owners recall flooring it onto the highway only to feel the engine moan and wheeze, as if it were being asked to do something unnatural. One owner summed it up perfectly. "It looked like a sports car, but it drove like my dad's Chevy Celebrity." Another recalled that the engine note, instead of a deep V8 burble, was a strained nasal drone that made the car sound like it was begging for mercy. This mismatch between promise and delivery made the RS 3.1 a classic case of marketing over substance. Chevrolet had essentially designed the RS as the Camaro for everyone, a way to give budget-conscious buyers the look of a performance car without the cost or the insurance premiums of a Z28. In other words, it was a muscle car in drag only. Sure, you got sporty trims, stripes, alloy wheels, and maybe even a spoiler, but you also got the same weak motor found in GM's economy sedans. For high schoolers in the early 1990s, this was often the car their parents were willing to buy them. It had just enough cool factor to avoid total social disaster, but not enough power to get them into serious trouble. As one former RS owner put it, "The only racing I ever won was against kids on bicycles, and sometimes that was close." The problems didn't stop at performance. Build quality, like much of GM's output at the time, was lackluster. Interiors were full of brittle plastics that cracked in the sun, dashboards warped, door panels rattled, and headliners sagged within a few years. The seats were unsupportive, cloth frayed easily, and the electrical systems were notorious for glitches. Meanwhile, the 3.1 V6 engine itself wasn't exactly a paragon of reliability. Intake manifold gasket leaks were common, cooling issues plagued many owners, and the engine management systems often left the car running rough or stalling at the worst times.
Combine all that with rust-prone bodywork in northern climates, and you had a car that aged poorly even when new. By the late 1990s, many of these RS Camaros were already being scrapped, sold for parts, or left to rot in backyards, their once sleek profiles dulled under layers of faded paint and oxidation. And yet, despite all of its flaws, the RS 3.1 has carved out a strange place in the modern collector market. In 2025, while Z28s and IROC Zs have become legitimate collector items, commanding impressive prices, the humble RS with its weak V6 remains at the very bottom of the Camaro hierarchy. Still, nostalgia has a funny way of distorting value. Sellers today list these cars online with inflated asking prices, touting them as rare RS editions or survivor cars, when in truth they were undesirable from the start. Rarity doesn't equal desirability, and the reason clean examples are rare today is not because people cherish them, but because most people happily let them go. For enthusiasts, the RS V6 serves as a cautionary tale about badge engineering and the dangers of relying too much on image over substance. Chevrolet thought that slapping an RS badge and sporty styling onto an underpowered platform would satisfy buyers, but the mismatch only created disappointment. A Camaro without muscle is like a jukebox without music. It may look the part, but it can't deliver the experience that made the name legendary. Owners who remember them today often recall fond memories, not because the car was thrilling, but because it was a backdrop to their youth. In many cases, these cars were first loves, first drives, or first heartbreaks, the kinds of vehicles you laugh about years later. In the end, the 1991 Camaro RS 3.1 V6 is remembered less as a performance machine and more as a symbol of compromise during an era when American car makers were struggling to balance insurance rates, emission standards, and consumer expectations. It looked sharp parked outside a diner on Friday night, but when the stoplight turned green, the only thing it proved was how far Chevrolet had drifted from its own muscle car roots. In 2025, when collectors pay big money for true performance Camaros, the RS 3.1 sits as a reminder that not every Camaro was a hero. Some were just pretenders in flashy clothes. Do you want me to expand this series with the 1990 Pontiac Firebird Base V6 as a twin disappointment to this Camaro, since it shared the same flaws but wore Pontiac's so-called excitement badge?
The 1993 Pontiac Firebird formula with the LT1 engine should have been a hero car, a rebirth of Pontiac's muscle credentials as the all-new fourth-generation Firebird debuted. On paper, it looked like a bargain, essentially the same potent LT1 V8 found in the Corvette, stuffed into a sleeker, futuristic F-body at a much lower price point. The formula was supposed to be the no-nonsense performance model, stripped of unnecessary flash like the Trans Am's wings and ground effects, yet still offering serious firepower. For enthusiasts, it seemed like the smart buy, Corvette power in a cheaper package. But in practice, the reality of these early LT1 formulas fell short, and 30 years later, their flaws stand out more clearly than their strengths. The LT1 was rated at 275 horsepower, which by early 1990s standards was stout. It was enough to shove the Firebird to 60 in the mid-6-second range, if you had the manual transmission. The problem came with the optional 4L60 automatic, a gearbox that dulled the LT1's edge to a disappointing degree. The transmission was notorious for its sluggish shifts and tendency to sap the immediacy of throttle response, making the car feel heavy and lethargic despite the power on tap. Owners who bought automatics often complained that the car felt like it was straining against its own hardware, never delivering the raw punch that the spec sheet promised. A former owner summed it up bitterly. You could hear the LT1 roaring under the hood, but the automatic felt like it was pulling an anchor. Worse, the LT1 itself was not without problems. Unlike the traditional small blocks GM had its reputation on, the new LT1 used a reverse flow cooling system that ran coolant to the cylinder heads first before the block. In theory, this allowed for higher compression and better performance. In practice, it led to chronic overheating issues, especially when the cooling system wasn't meticulously maintained. Radiators clogged, water pumps failed, and blown head gaskets weren't uncommon. Combine that with an OptiSpark ignition system mounted inconveniently on the front of the engine, vulnerable to heat and moisture, and the LT1 quickly gained a reputation for being finicky at best and frustrating at worst. Beyond the drivetrain, the 1993 Firebird suffered from many of GM's early 1990s sins. Build quality was inconsistent, with panel gaps you could see from across a parking lot, rattling interior trim, and cheap plastics that looked futuristic when new, but aged terribly. Dashboards cracked, radio controls wore down to blank nubs, and the interior plastics turned brittle and discolored in the sun. The cloth seats sagged early, the vinyl tore, and leather trim, if you paid extra for it, was thin and prone to cracking. Add in leaky T-tops, which was a common feature on these cars, and many formulas were literally rotting away within a decade of leaving the dealership. Rust was another killer, particularly in northern climates. The underside was poorly protected, and salt chewed through floor pans, rocker panels, and wheel arches with disturbing efficiency. By the early 2000s, countless formulas had already been scrapped, not because they weren't fast, but because their bodies and interiors disintegrated faster than their owners could keep up with repairs. Those that survived were often heavily modified, raced, or abused, leaving very few clean, original examples on the market today. Despite all this, nostalgia has begun to inflate the value of these early LT1 Firebirds in 2025. Sellers tout them as Corvette-powered bargains and list even tired examples at high prices, pointing to their relative rarity compared to the more common Trans Ams. But the truth is, while the formula offered impressive numbers in its day, the ownership experience was often disappointing. Between the automatic transmission dulling performance, the LT1's inherent weaknesses, and GM's cost-cutting interiors, the car never fully lived up to the promise of its styling and pedigree. Enthusiasts who owned them often remember the sound and presence fondly, but not the headaches. One former owner reflected, "When it ran, it felt like a muscle car again, but I spent more time under the hood or chasing electrical gremlins than I ever did just enjoying it." That sums up the Firebird Formula LT1 perfectly. A car that looked incredible and should have been a legend, but too often reminded you of GM's quality control failures of the era. Would you like me to continue this theme with the 1994 to 95 Camaro Z28 LT1 Automatic as its sibling disappointment, since it suffered from the exact same drivetrain flaws and build quality issues?
The 1994 Dodge Stealth SOHC base model is the perfect example of how appearance alone can fool buyers into thinking they were getting something exotic. In the early 1990s, the Mitsubishi 3000 GT and its badge-engineered twin, the Dodge Stealth, hit the US market with radical styling that looked ripped straight from a Japanese concept car. With its wide stance, pop-up headlights, and swooping body lines, even the base Stealth looked like it belonged in the same conversation as a Toyota Super Turbo, Nissan 300ZX twin-turbo, or Acura NSX. But for the poor soul who bought the entry-level SOHC version, the experience was anything but supercar-like. Underneath the wild body, the base Stealth was more minivan than Ferrari. The heart of the disappointment lay under the hood. Instead of the high-revving DOH CV6 or the mighty twin-turbocharged AWD system offered on the RT twin-turbo, the base Stealth made do with a single overhead cam 3.0-liter V6 that produced just 164 horsepower. Considering the car weighed over 3,000 pounds, that output translated into painfully sluggish performance. 0 to 60 took over 9 seconds, which was slower than a 4-cylinder Honda Accord of the same year. The base Stealth's acceleration was so underwhelming that owners often described it as flooring it and waiting for something to happen. One owner bluntly recalled, "It looked like a Ferrari in the driveway, but it drove like my mom's Caravan." The problem wasn't just straight-line speed, it was the whole package. The SOHC model came only with front-wheel drive, and without the active aerodynamics, all-wheel drive, and electronic suspension trickery of its Halo sibling, the base Stealth was just another nose-heavy front-drive coupe. Handling wasn't uninspiring, plagued by understeer and body roll when pushed. The steering was numb, the suspension tuning soft, and despite the dramatic styling, it simply wasn't fun to drive hard. Buyers expecting a bargain exotic quickly discovered they had bought nothing more than a flashy commuter car in a Halloween costume. Inside, the illusion continued to fall apart. While the dashboard had a driver-focused design with its wraparound cockpit look, the materials were pure Chrysler-Mitsubishi cost-cutting. Plastic scratched easily, cloth seats wore down fast, and creaks developed within a few years. The optional leather seats were stiff and cracked early, especially in hotter climates. Reliability wasn't stellar either. Owners frequently complained of electrical gremlins, fragile transmissions, and chronic oil leaks from the 3.0 SOHC engine. Many base Stealths wound up in junkyards by the early 2000s, scrapped not because they were rare, but because they were simply not worth fixing. By the mid-1990s, the automotive press was already calling out the Stealth SOHC as a car that promised much more than it delivered. Road and Track quipped that the base car's looks were writing checks its drivetrain can't cash, and many buyers traded them in quickly for something that actually delivered on performance. Even period owners admitted that the only fun the car provided was the reactions from people who thought they were looking at a $40,000 sports car instead of a dressed-up front-drive Dodge. Fast forward to 2025, and the situation has only gotten stranger. As the Japanese performance car market has exploded in value, sellers are now trying to ride the wave by hyping up even the base Stealth as rare collector's items. Listings frequently use terms like JDM styling or future classic, while slapping ridiculous price tags on cars that, at the end of the day, remain heavy, slow, and compromised. Enthusiasts know better. Nobody seriously looking for a performance car is shopping for an SOHC Stealth, because no matter how glossy the paint or how shiny the aftermarket wheels, it can't escape its identity as the poser of the lineup. Collectors and enthusiasts alike agree that only the DOHC and especially the twin-turbo Stealths deserve real attention. The base SOHC cars remain the forgotten stepchildren, flashy to look at, embarrassing to drive, and in no way deserving of the supercar money some sellers are asking in 2025. To quote another ex-owner, "Owning a base Stealth was like dating a model who couldn't string a sentence together. Looked amazing at first, but the longer you stayed, the more you realized you made a huge mistake." Would you like me to follow this up with a 1991 Mitsubishi 3000 GT base model write-up, since it was the same underwhelming package in disguise?
The 1995 Chevy Monte Carlo Z34 is one of those 1990s cars that looked like it had potential, sounded like it had potential, but in reality became a rolling example of GM's worst habits at the time: overpromising, under-engineering, and leaving owners to pay the price. When Chevy revived the Monte Carlo name in the mid-90s, it leaned heavily on NASCAR connections and heritage, promising a car that could bring back some of the performance credibility of the classic SS models from the 1970s and 1980s. The top-tier Z34 was supposed to be that car. On paper, it even looked decent. A high-output 3.4-liter DOHC V6, aggressive styling touches, and a price tag that undercut imports like the Nissan Maxima SE and Mitsubishi Eclipse GSX. But the Z34 turned out to be a nightmare in practice, a car that aged badly even when new. The problem started with the infamous LQ1 3.4-liter DOHC V6 itself. Advertised at 210 horsepower, it seemed promising for the era, but owners quickly discovered that it was one of the most maintenance-heavy engines GM ever unleashed on the public. With 4 camshafts, complex timing belts, and cramped engine bay packaging, even basic service like replacing spark plugs or timing belts turned into a costly ordeal. Mechanics groaned when these cars rolled into their bays, and owners groaned when they saw the repair bills. The timing belt alone was supposed to be replaced every 60,000 miles, but failure often led to catastrophic engine damage. As one frustrated former owner put it, every oil change felt like a countdown to the next financial disaster. Reliability didn't stop at the engine. The 4T60E automatic transmission was notoriously fragile, especially when paired with the 3.4's peaky, high-rev in nature. Hard driving or even just normal commuting could wear them out prematurely, leading to sudden failures and expensive replacements. Add to that GM's 1990s-era electrical system, which was infamous for random shorts, flickering gauges, dead power windows, and quirky ABS sensors, and the Z34 became a car that spent as much time in the shop as it did on the road. One owner from the Midwest recalled that his Monte Carlo Z34's dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree once a week, with every warning light coming on at once, only to mysteriously reset the next morning. Performance, meanwhile, was disappointing. Despite the flashy advertising, the car was heavy, with a curb weight well over 3,300 pounds, and the 3.4 DOHC never delivered the kind of torque it needed for low-end grunt. 0 to 60 hovered in the high 7 to 8 second range, which was unimpressive given the hype. Worse, the engine's narrow power band and rough character meant it never felt refined, especially when paired with the slushy automatic. It was caught in no man's land, too heavy and clumsy to be a true sport coupe, too complicated and unreliable to be a sensible commuter. The interior didn't help its case. While Chevrolet tried to make the Z34 look sporty with bucket seats and a driver-focused dash, the materials were typical mid-1990s GM: hard plastics, rattling trim, and cloth that wore thin within a few years. The car may have been marketed as a performance coupe, but it didn't have the comfort, durability, or execution that its rivals delivered. Compared to a Toyota Camry coupe or even a Honda Prelude of the same era, the Monte Carlo felt cheap and hastily built. By the early 2000s, most Z34s had either blown head gaskets, dead transmissions, or both. Many were junked after just a decade on the road, with owners deciding it wasn't worth pouring thousands into a car that wasn't particularly desirable even when running well. The survivors today are few, and most of them are sitting half dead behind barns, under tarps in backyards, or limping along with patched-up engines and transmissions. Ironically, some sellers in 2025 are now trying to cash in on nostalgia, advertising the Z34 as a rare 90s performance car. But enthusiasts know better. There's a reason they're rare, and it isn't because they were cherished collectibles. As one blunt owner summed it up perfectly, the Z34 gave me two things: endless bills and endless regrets. In the end, the 1995 Chevy Monte Carlo Z34 wasn't a revival of the Monte Carlo legacy, but the car that quietly killed it for good. Do you want me to also cover its Pontiac twin, the Grand Prix GTP with the same 3.4 DOHC, since it suffered all the same failures but carried even more broken promises?
The 1990 Ford Thunderbird Super Coupe represents one of the most ambitious yet frustrating chapters in Ford's history. A car that promised a high-tech, American luxury performance experience, but in practice often delivered headaches instead of thrills. Ford wanted the Super Coupe to resurrect the Thunderbird name as a modern halo vehicle, appealing to buyers who craved European-style performance and cutting-edge technology without leaving the domestic brand. To that end, they packed the car with a 3.8-liter supercharged V6, rated at 210 horsepower and 315 pound-feet of torque. On paper, this engine promised muscle, acceleration, and torque comparable to lighter, naturally aspirated V8s of the era. In reality, the combination of a heavy platform, nascent electronics, and complex systems created a vehicle that was brilliant in concept, but flawed in execution. One of the defining characteristics of the 1990 Super Coupe was its weight. The car tipped the scales at nearly 3,700 pounds, considerably heavier than contemporaries in the Grand National or Corvette class. That weight, paired with the relatively modest output of the supercharged 3.8-liter V6, meant the car's acceleration, while respectable, often felt muted. 0 to 60 times were typically around 6 seconds, which was decent for a luxury coupe of the time,
but the Super Coupe lacked the immediacy or raw, visceral feel that buyers expected from a performance model. Drivers often described the car as having an elastic throttle response. The engine would build power, but the sensation of acceleration never fully matched the numbers on paper. Cornering was similarly compromised. The suspension, tuned to balance ride comfort and sportiness, couldn't fully manage the car's bulk, resulting in noticeable body roll and understeer during aggressive driving. Enthusiasts expecting a nimble, fun-to-drive sports coupe were often disappointed once they left the dealership. What truly defined the Super Coupe and ultimately contributed to its infamous reputation was its electronics. The car featured an array of advanced systems for the era: computer-controlled supercharger management, electronically regulated suspension components, anti-lock brakes, and early engine control modules designed to optimize power delivery. These systems, though innovative, were notoriously fragile. Electrical gremlins were common. Gauges would fail, warning lights would flicker unpredictably, ABS sensors malfunctioned, and fuel injection or supercharger controls occasionally cut power without warning. Owners quickly realized that the car's futuristic features could be more trouble than they were worth, turning what should have been a thrilling ride into a frustrating series of trips to the dealer. One long-term owner recounted, "You'd start the car and it would roar like a beast, but then the dashboard would start flashing every light in the book, the supercharger would hiccup, and by the time it was running smoothly, you'd already lost your adrenaline rush." Maintenance costs further tarnished the Super Coupe's appeal. Servicing the supercharged V6 required careful attention to the supercharger pulley system, timing belt, and forced induction lubrication. Specialized components and parts were expensive, and not every mechanic was equipped or willing to work on them. Electronics repairs could rival the cost of the engine itself, especially when modules failed or sensors misread critical information. For many owners, the car became a financial trap, fun to drive when working, but capable of draining savings during the next unavoidable repair cycle. Even the interior, designed to feel modern and luxurious, suffered from Ford's cost-cutting. Dashboard plastics warped, seats sagged, trim rattled, and early model electronics for climate control, stereo, and instrument clusters were prone to failure. T-tops, offered on many models, introduced potential for leaks, creaks, and water damage, further accelerating the car's deterioration over time. By the late 1990s, many early Super Coupes were already showing the wear of their fragile components, with some abandoned, scrapped, or cannibalized for parts to keep other examples running. By 2025, the 1990 Thunderbird Super Coupe has achieved a strange sort of notoriety. Collectors may be drawn to it because of its supercharged engine, striking looks, and place in Ford's history. But any would-be buyer must approach with caution. The reality is that most early Super Coupes surviving today are suffering from the cumulative effects of decades of delicate electronics, worn suspension components, and deferred maintenance. The combination of heavy weight, complex systems, and fragile parts make them expensive to restore or maintain to reliable, drivable condition. While the car can still impress at first glance with its sleek lines and hidden supercharged potential, it remains a car that punishes the unwary and demands respect from anyone who takes it seriously. Enthusiasts often recall the paradox of the 1990 CP, a car that could, when fully functional, launch from a stoplight with a surprising rush of torque, yet simultaneously require constant attention to keep that rush available. In essence, the Super Coupe was a car ahead of its time in ambition, but behind the curve in execution. While it remains an intriguing footnote in Ford's performance history, it serves as a cautionary tale for collectors in 2025. A visually stunning, technologically advanced coupe that is simultaneously a wallet-draining, delicate machine. Its beauty and potential exist in tension with its fragility, and anyone considering ownership must reconcile that thrilling promise with decades of mechanical reality. Would you like me to expand this series further with the 1991 through 1993 Ford Thunderbird Super Coupe revisions, which addressed some reliability issues but still left the car heavy, electronically complex, and largely unworthy of inflated 2025 asking prices?
The 1996 Pontiac Sunfire GT is one of those rare cars where marketing and reality diverged so completely that it's almost comical in retrospect. Pontiac's goal was simple: take a cheap, lightweight economy car and dress it up with enough sporty cues to convince buyers that they were getting a small-bore performance machine. At first glance, it seemed promising. The Sunfire GT offered alloy wheels, front air dams, subtle rear spoilers, sportier seat fabric, and sometimes a slightly firmer suspension compared to the base Sunfire. Advertisements implied that behind the plastic bodywork and trim enhancements lurked a compact car that could deliver a fun, agile, youthful driving experience. What buyers discovered in the real world, however, was an entirely different story. A noisy, plasticky, underpowered machine that was a joke compared to even modestly competent sports cars of the era. Under the hood, the GT was typically equipped with a 2.3-liter single overhead cam inline-4 engine, producing roughly 120 horsepower. On a vehicle weighing just under 2,600 pounds, that might sound okay for commuting, but it was painfully insufficient for spirited driving. 0 to 60 times hovered around 10 seconds, and passing slower cars on the highway often required dropping into the uncomfortable mechanical limits of the engine. Enthusiasts looking for any hint of acceleration excitement were greeted instead with a flat, lifeless response. The 2.3-liter engine's torque was meager, particularly at low RPMs, making highway on-ramps and merging an exercise in patience rather than exhilaration. Even small hills could sap speed if the car was carrying a passenger or light cargo. Steering was vague and disconnected, offering no sense of engagement or road feel, while the soft suspension allowed significant body roll, further undermining any illusion of sportiness. The interior did nothing to improve the experience. Hard, brittle plastics dominated the cabin, and while Pontiac attempted to make the seats more supportive in GT trim, they remained thin and uncomfortable for anything beyond short commutes. The dashboard and instrument layout looked utilitarian, and small annoyances like rattling trim, loose vents, and faulty switches were common. The car's electronics, simple by modern standards, were prone to minor but aggravating failures, such as flickering interior lights, malfunctioning wipers, and occasional gauge misreads. Road noise, already amplified by the Sunfire's thin body panels, made the cabin a noisy place at higher speeds. By the late 1990s, many owners discovered that these seemingly trivial flaws compounded into a car that felt cheap, fragile, and thoroughly unworthy of the GT badge plastered across its hatch. Pontiac leaned heavily on the Sunfire GT's looks to sell excitement. Pop-up or projector-style headlamps, sharp hood lines, and aftermarket-inspired spoilers suggested performance potential that simply didn't exist. The car was light enough to feel agile in slow parking lot maneuvers, but when pushed at highway speeds or through corners, the weak suspension and soft steering betrayed the driver immediately. A casual observer might have thought this was a car capable of sporty fun, but in reality, it was a demonstration of how effective styling and marketing can be at creating an illusion of performance. One owner from the 1990s said, "Everyone thought I had a little sports car. I thought so too, until I tried to pass a minivan on the interstate." Another bluntly remarked, "It looks fast, it isn't. That's the truth." Reliability issues further undermined the Sunfire GT. While it was mechanically simple compared to higher performance vehicles, parts were cheap and often fragile. Electrical systems, wiring harnesses, and switches were prone to minor but persistent failures. Suspension bushings wore out quickly, producing squeaks and clunks, and the soft brakes offered minimal feedback, which was dangerous when drivers tried to push the car in any spirited fashion. Combine all of this with a cheap interior prone to wear and fading, and the Sunfire GT aged rapidly. By the late 1990s, many had already been junked, scrapped, or relegated to second cars for commuters who didn't care about performance.
Despite this, in 2025, the Sunfire GT occasionally appears on online listings as a rare Pontiac muscle compact or budget 90s collectible. Sellers often highlight alloy wheels, GT badges, and the fact that surviving examples are scarce due to attrition over the decades. Yet any serious collector or enthusiast knows the reality. The Sunfire GT was never a performance machine, never particularly desirable, and never worth the hype it was given. Scarcity in this case is simply the result of neglect, scrapping, and the passage of time, not inherent value or historical significance. Those who buy one thinking they are picking up a hidden gem are usually in for a disappointment. In the end, the 1996 Pontiac Sunfire GT is remembered less as a true sports car and more as a study of style over substance. It serves as a cautionary tale. You can wrap plastic, spoilers, and decals around a car and call it a GT, but if the engine, chassis, and interior cannot deliver, the illusion falls apart quickly. Its legacy is one of cheap excitement and dashed expectations, a noisy, fragile, and forgettable econobox masquerading as a sporty coupe. Enthusiasts often describe it with a mixture of nostalgia and exasperation. It was fun to look at, occasionally fun to drive around a parking lot, but ultimately a disappointment behind the wheel. If you want, I can continue this series with the 1995 to 1997 Chevrolet Cavalier Z24, which was basically Pontiac's twin in disguise, a slightly more aggressive package on the same platform with equally laughable sport pretensions and the same underpowered fragile performance.
The 1992 Dodge Daytona IROC RT is a textbook example of hype outweighing reality. A car that promised performance but delivered frustration. In the early 1990s, Dodge leaned heavily on the IROC name, hoping to evoke memories of the Daytona's glory days as a performance halo in the late 1980s. The RT badge implied speed, excitement, and a muscle-inspired driving experience, but beneath the flashy graphics, spoilers, and lowered suspension was a front-wheel drive coupe with a 4-cylinder turbo engine that could barely keep up with a modern compact sedan. For anyone expecting IROC-level performance, the disappointment was immediate and sharp. Under the hood, the Daytona IROC RT typically came with Chrysler's 2.2-liter turbocharged inline-4 rated around 174 horsepower. On paper, that seemed respectable for a car of its size. In reality, the Daytona's weight, over 2,700 pounds, and torque-steer-prone front-wheel drive layout meant that the engine struggled to translate power effectively to the pavement. Acceleration was sluggish off the line, and while the turbo could produce a noticeable kick at higher RPMs, it was peaky and temperamental, leaving the car slow in everyday driving situations. Owners frequently noted that the car felt all hat, no cattle. The flashy styling suggested speed, but the reality was more akin to a commuter car with attitude problems. The front-wheel drive setup amplified the car's weaknesses, pushed the Daytona hard in corners, and the suspension geometry, paired with the narrow tires of the era, produced understeer so pronounced that most drivers had to back off mid-corner. Steering was numb, brakes felt soft, and the car had little grip in wet conditions, making any spirited driving a precarious experience. For a car marketed as an RT performance model, this was a bitter pill to swallow. Enthusiasts who tried to extract its advertised potential often found themselves frustrated, nursing a fragile turbo, sticky transmission, and delicate suspension components. Reliability was another major concern. The 2.2-liter turbo engine was notorious for head gasket failures, cracked manifolds, and premature turbo wear, especially if the car was driven aggressively. Electrical gremlins were common, affecting gauges, dash lighting, and turbo control systems. The transmissions, mostly manual 5-speeds, were delicate, with synchro failures and worn shift linkages cropping up under spirited use. Even routine maintenance could be expensive and tricky, as the tight engine bay and turbo plumbing complicated repairs. One former owner recalled, "I barely had time to enjoy the turbo kick before I was back in the garage fixing something." The interior did little to inspire confidence or excitement.
Cheap plastics, flimsy seats, and a minimalist dash meant that the cockpit looked sporty but felt hollow. Over time, trim would warp or crack, seat cushions would sag, and switches would fail. The combination of subpar interior quality and mechanical fragility made the Daytona IROC RT feel more like a temporary novelty than a serious performance coupe. By 2025, surviving examples of the 1992 Dodge Daytona IROC RT are often overpriced relics of early 90s marketing. Sellers market them as classic turbo hatchbacks or rare FWD performance cars, sometimes highlighting the IROC branding as proof of pedigree. But expert enthusiasts know the truth. The car was never fast in a usable way, it was fragile, and it has aged poorly. Rust, worn suspension components, leaking turbo plumbing, and failing electronics dominate the survivor pool, leaving most examples as overpriced junk rather than collectible performance machines. Enthusiasts often describe owning a Daytona IROC RT as a study in frustration. You could read the specs and imagine a lively, fun car, but the reality was a fragile, temperamental, front-wheel drive coupe that couldn't match the promise. One former owner summed it up perfectly. It looked like it could outrun a Mustang, but in practice, it barely kept up with a Corolla and cost way more in repairs. The 1992 Dodge Daytona IROC RT remains an artifact of early 90s marketing hubris. Flashy, hyped, and ultimately disappointing. A cautionary tale for anyone chasing nostalgia over substance. If you want, I can continue this era with the 1991 Plymouth Laser RS Turbo, which was basically a twin of the Daytona IROC RT and suffered all the same failures, making it another fast-on-paper, worthless-in-reality car. The 1998 Mercury Cougar New Edge is a textbook case of automotive marketing outpacing reality. A car that looked as if it could deliver sporty thrills, but was, underneath, a study in compromise and disappointment. Ford's plan was ambitious on paper: resurrect a nameplate with deep heritage, evoke nostalgia for the original Cougars of the 60s and early 70s, and simultaneously attract a younger audience seeking a sleek, modern coupe. To the casual observer, it succeeded. Its sharp new edge styling, low-slung profile, aggressive front fascia, and slightly muscular rear end made it appear purposeful, almost fast. Advertisements reinforced this idea, showing the car slicing down winding roads, its curves emphasizing speed and agility. Yet, all of that gloss was skin deep. Beneath the body panels, the Cougar shared a platform with the humble Ford Contour, a front-wheel drive family sedan with economy car DNA. And the engines under the hood were equally unremarkable: a 2.5-liter V6 producing about 170 horsepower, or a slightly more potent 3.0-liter V6 around 200 horsepower. For a car that looked like it could tackle corners at speed and accelerate with gusto, these powertrains were painfully underwhelming. The front-wheel drive layout exacerbated the car's shortcomings, pushed the Cougar hard, and the engine's modest torque revealed itself in dramatic torque steer, especially in the 3.0-liter model. Acceleration, even when floor-mounted, felt lethargic, with 0 to 60 times lingering around 8 to 9 seconds, slow enough that any real sports car of the era would have left it behind without breaking a sweat. The suspension, soft and tuned for comfort, did little to inspire confidence in corners. Body roll was pronounced, steering feedback was numb, and the car's overall handling reminded drivers that it was fundamentally a rebadged Contour. Any pretense of a sports coupe experience evaporated the moment the wheels met twisty roads. Enthusiasts quickly learned that the new Edge Cougar was all style and no substance, a car that could look fast in pictures, but would never deliver performance worthy of its nameplate. Inside, Mercury tried to maintain a semblance of sophistication, but the cabin was a disappointment. Cheap plastics dominated the dash, doors, and center console, while seat bolstering was minimal and ergonomics were uninspiring. Controls were straightforward but unimpressive, and the electronics, while simple, were prone to minor failures, particularly in the climate control system and power accessories. Long-term reliability issues compounded the car's lackluster performance, leaving owners frustrated when mechanical simplicity didn't prevent frequent annoyances.
Some owners who purchased the car expecting a fun, sporty driving experience were met instead with rattles, road noise, and seats that lacked the support to make cornering feel dynamic, further emphasizing the gap between promise and reality. By the mid-2000s, the Cougar had largely disappeared from the roads, not due to rarity, but due to neglect and obsolescence. Front-wheel drive underpowered coupes rarely survive long when maintenance costs and drivability are mediocre. By 2025, the surviving new Edge Cougars are mostly low-mileage curiosities, often overlooked by collectors because the car offers no tunable performance, no historical significance, and no inherent excitement beyond styling. Online listings occasionally market them as rare late 90s sporty Mercuries or underrated sleepers, but these claims are laughable. The Cougar's entire premise was image over performance, and even nostalgia can't retrofit 25-year-old mediocrity into a true collectible. Many of the cars that do survive show wear in the suspension bushings, sagging seats, failing electronics, and faded interior plastics, reminders that even limited exposure to normal use exposes the Cougar's fundamental compromises. Enthusiasts who remember the car often do so with a mix of bemusement and frustration. One former owner noted, "It looked fast at first until you tried to pass a minivan, then reality hit. All style, zero speed." Another admitted, "I wanted a modern muscle car in a sleek coupe shell. What I got was a contour in a costume." Even the more potent 3.0-liter version, while slightly livelier, did little to change the equation. It was still a front-wheel drive econ box at heart, limited by torque steer, soft suspension, and modest horsepower. In many ways, the new Edge Cougar is emblematic of Mercury's late-era struggles, a brand relying on styling cues and nostalgia to sell cars that had fundamentally little to offer in performance or excitement. In conclusion, the 1998 Mercury Cougar New Edge remains a car of contradictions. It looked aggressive, it carried a proud nameplate, and it captured attention in parking lots. But the illusion ended as soon as the driver engaged the throttle. Heavy, underpowered, and front-wheel drive, it could never live up to its heritage. And today, in 2025, it stands as a largely forgotten joke among enthusiasts. Those who seek one as a collectible must come to terms with the reality in which this sporty coupe was never truly sporty, never credible, and never destined to be more than a styling exercise in nostalgia. If you want, I can continue this series with the 1997 to 1999 Ford Probe GT, which shared the Cougar's platform, styling ambitions, and underpowered FWD limitations, effectively serving as its equally disappointing twin. The 1991 Oldsmobile Toronado Trofeo is one of those rare cars where ambition and design clashed spectacularly with reality. On paper, it seemed like a futuristic take on the American personal luxury coupe. Sleek, wedge-shaped styling, a low-slung body, and technology-laden interiors that promised a high-tech driving experience. Oldsmobile even leaned into the Trofeo name, giving buyers the impression that this was something between a sporty coupe and a luxury cruiser. Unfortunately, the reality could not have been further from the marketing spin. The Toronado Trofeo was front-wheel drive, weighed over 3,800 pounds, and came with a modest 3.8-liter V6, producing roughly 170 horsepower. This combination resulted in a car that moved slowly, handled poorly, and had little to do with any traditional notion of muscle. Handling was perhaps the Toronado Trofeo's biggest disappointment. The long, heavy body and soft suspension gave the car the cornering dynamics of a barge. Steering was numb and imprecise, body roll was pronounced in every turn, and the front-heavy FWD layout exacerbated understeer, making spirited driving a hazardous proposition. Despite the car's aggressive, aerodynamic looks, it floated over corners with no feedback to the driver, undermining any sense of engagement or excitement. Even highway driving could be unpleasant. Crosswinds, rough pavement, and poor suspension damping combined to make the car feel less like a personal luxury coupe and more like a floating boat that required constant attention to keep it on course. Under the hood, the Toronado Trofeo was equally disappointing.
The 3.8-liter V6 was smooth and reasonably reliable for everyday commuting, but its 170 horsepower and modest torque were hardly sufficient for a car of this size and weight. Acceleration was lethargic, with 0 to 60 times hovering around 8 to 9 seconds, sluggish for a coupe marketed as a performance-oriented luxury machine. Passing slower vehicles required careful planning and heavy throttle application, which was further hampered by the front-wheel drive layout and the car's significant curb weight. The engine was competent at cruising speeds, but any attempt to push it for performance quickly highlighted its limitations. The interior, while futuristic for its day, was another area where compromise undermined ambition. Oldsmobile equipped the Trofeo with digital displays, early electronic climate control, and a driver-focused instrument layout, but the materials were largely hard plastics, and the seats offered minimal lateral support. Over time, wear and tear revealed rattles, sagging upholstery, and electronic quirks, all of which made the cabin feel cheap compared to the car's marketing promises. Despite the advanced technology and flashy layout, the driving experience failed to match the aesthetics. Reliability was a mixed bag. The 3.8-liter engine itself was reasonably durable, but electronics were prone to glitches, including dashboard displays and climate controls. Suspension bushings wore quickly, and the heavy body aggravated tire wear and braking stress. Parts for the Trofeo are rare today, and while the car survives in small numbers, maintenance can be costly and frustrating, especially for those who expected it to be a muscle coupe worthy of attention.
The 1997 Plymouth Breeze Expresso is a perfect example of how branding and superficial styling can't compensate for a fundamentally unexciting car. By the late 1990s, Plymouth was struggling to stay relevant, and the company leaned on marketing gimmicks like espresso trims to generate interest. On paper, the Breeze Expresso was supposed to feel sportier, younger, and more vibrant than the standard Breeze. It featured bold decals, unique two-tone paint schemes, slightly revised interior trim, and small exterior tweaks intended to create a visual sense of energy. The goal was simple: make buyers believe this economy sedan could feel fun without actually improving performance. Underneath, however, the Breeze Expresso was entirely unchanged. It shared its platform and components with the Dodge Neon and Plymouth Breeze base models. Engines were weak 2.0-liter inline fours, producing around 132 horsepower, moving a car that weighed roughly 2,500 pounds. Acceleration was sluggish, 0 to 60 times hovered around 10 seconds, and passing slower traffic often required pushing the engine to its limits. Any notion of sportiness evaporated the moment you touched the throttle. Handling was soft and uninspiring, with vague steering, noticeable body roll, and a suspension tuned more for comfort than cornering. Torque steer and front-wheel drive limitations further undermined any pretense of performance. The interior was equally disappointing. While Plymouth added minor cosmetic touches for the Expresso trim, like different fabric or contrasting colors, the seats offered minimal support, the plastics were cheap, and ergonomics were mediocre. Dash layouts were plain, gauges uninspired, and electronic quirks were common even in a new car. The cabin environment did little to convince anyone they were driving a sporty vehicle, and over time, rattles, sagging upholstery, and faded trim became almost inevitable. Reliability was typical of Chrysler's compact offerings of the era, generally acceptable but prone to minor annoyances. The 2.0-liter engine was robust enough for daily commuting, but issues with the automatic transmission, electrical systems, and interior trim plagued owners. Any real effort to make the car fun with aftermarket modifications was hampered by limited engine potential and weak chassis dynamics. Enthusiasts quickly dismissed the car as a marketing gimmick. An Expresso badge and vinyl decals could not turn a neon Breeze into a performance machine. By 2025, the Plymouth Breeze Expresso exists mostly as a punchline among collectors and former enthusiasts. Sellers sometimes advertise them as rare sporty 90s Plymouths or hidden gems, but these claims are entirely overstated. The car offers no performance potential, no collectible appeal, and no excitement beyond a nostalgia-fueled curiosity. Survivors are typically rusted, neglected, or sold as inexpensive commuter vehicles. Those few that remain in decent condition are almost always sought for cheap, ironic novelty rather than any genuine appreciation of the car's driving dynamics. Enthusiasts who remember the Breeze Espresso often do so with amusement when recalled, "I thought it looked cool for a high school car, but driving it was like piloting a cardboard box with stickers." Another commented, "The decals were fun, but 0 horsepower meant 0 fun." The car is a perfect example of late-era Plymouth marketing, style and graphics over substance, an attempt to revive a dying brand with superficial tricks that never fooled anyone who cared about performance. In essence, the 1997 Plymouth Breeze Espresso is a car that only exists in memory as a joke or a minor curiosity. It had no right to call itself sporty, offered no performance upgrades, and today is worthless as a collector item. It is a reminder that decals, trim packages, and special edition names cannot make a fundamentally bland economy car into a true performance vehicle. The 1994 Chevrolet Lumina Z34 is a stark reminder that a sporty badge and aggressive styling cannot make a car perform when the underlying engineering is mediocre at best. Chevrolet attempted to take the dull, mid-sized Lumina and transform it into a performance coupe for the mid-90s. They added a higher output 3.4-liter DOHC V6, sportier suspension tuning, and more aggressive exterior trim. Unique Z34 badging, spoilers, and revised front and rear fascias meant to suggest speed. On paper, it seemed like an affordable way to get into a mid-90s American muscle-style coupe. In reality, the Z34 failed in almost every dimension that mattered to enthusiasts, and its reputation has aged poorly. Mechanically, the heart of the car, the 3.4 DOHC V6, was a problem from the start. While it produced more power than the base V6, roughly 210 horsepower, it was temperamental and unreliable. Early DOHC engines suffered from oil consumption issues, cooling problems, and head gasket failures, particularly if the car was pushed hard or maintenance was neglected. Transmission problems compounded the issues. The automatic unit often struggled to handle the engine's torque, slipping under load or failing prematurely. Even the manual 5-speed variants offered little joy, as gearing was poorly matched to the engine's torque curve, leaving the car feeling lethargic in real-world driving. Owners frequently reported repeated trips to mechanics just to keep the car running, a far cry from the thrill of a true muscle coupe. Handling and driving dynamics were another letdown. The Lumina's chassis, designed for comfort over performance, could not support the sporty pretensions of the Z34. Steering was vague and imprecise, body roll was excessive, and braking performance was underwhelming even by mid-90s standards. Despite suspension tweaks for the Z34, the car's front-heavy balance and soft geometry made cornering a cautious exercise rather than a thrilling experience. Torque steer on the V6-powered models was noticeable, further limiting any real-world excitement. Enthusiasts who remember the Z34 tend to do so with frustration. One former owner commented, "It looked fast at the stoplight, but the engine felt weak and always needed something fixed." Another quipped, "They call it a muscle coupe, but it couldn't muscle a grocery cart uphill." Its legacy is firmly rooted in disappointment, a car that tried to appear sporty but could not deliver in power, handling, or reliability. In conclusion, the 1994 Lumina Z34 is a cautionary footnote in 90s American performance history. A flashy body kit and a DOHC V6 cannot replace poor engineering, weak chassis design, and an unreliable driveway. It never belonged in the same conversation as true performance coupes, and in 2025, its reputation remains as a largely worthless, overhyped relic. If you want, I can continue this era with the 1995 to 97 Pontiac Sunfire GT, which shares many of the same flaws as the Z34. Overhyped styling, underpowered engines, and a legacy of disappointment.